Welcome back for Section 3, which is entitled U.S. Ocean Transportation. In this section, we're going to give a brief history of the U.S. ocean transportation market and its evolution over the last 40 years, as well as start to describe and provide some pretty detailed definitions of who the key players are in the ocean transportation ecosystem. Let's begin by having a quick look at that history lesson we spoke of during our agenda discussion. Beginning in the 1970s, because that's really when things started to heat up a little bit, a number of factors drove the evolution of the U.S. ocean import market to its current state. The first was the worldwide use of the ocean container. We actually have an upcoming supply chain perspective on the invention of the ocean container, but for now, let's just say, without the ocean container, and we can see them on the ship in the image to the right, there would be no globalization. Let's just start with that. Second sub-bullet point, the liberalization of trade, where countries started to reduce both tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade, just making it easier for countries, companies, and individuals to do business together. That's a long history starting at the end of World War II. Of course, the emergence of China as the world's factory, and it remains and likely will remain the world's factory for some time. Needless to say, the growth of importation via ocean freight into the U.S. just wouldn't have happened without China. Last sub-bullet point, also, in addition to China, growth in other developing countries in Asia, Singapore, Taiwan, Southeast Asia, but certainly other parts of the world as well. Europe, Latin America, Australia, New Zealand, and Africa. Little more history. These factors that drove the accelerated evolution of the U.S. ocean import market. Well, number one, since the 1970s, we as a society in the United States have evolved towards an import-oriented market. That's expressed in our trade deficit. We import way more than we export. That's just a simple but stark reality. Another is the advent of intermodal shipping. We've spoken of intermodal a bunch of times. We have a whole module on intermodal in the United States, but intermodal, sometimes referred to as multimodal, is just that, multiple modes of transportation under the same bill of lading. We don't want to get too far into the operational weeds here, but we're talking about combining truck to rail to truck for final destination in the United States. It could also be ocean freight for containers coming in from Europe, come into the port of Norfolk on the U.S. East Coast that are transferred from a ship onto rail under the same bill of lading. Multimodal, also referred to as inland point intermodal. We'll get into all of that later. Enhancements to supply chain and logistics technology, the technology of the ships themselves, out in the physical world technology, more efficient port operations, etc., but also enhancements to software, a very big theme that has indeed accelerated the U.S. ocean import market. And then finally, we never want to diminish the role of the freight forwarder in all of this, which is arguably one of the key entities, if not the key entity, that helps to integrate this inbound logistics chain that we spoke of in the previous section. Once again, we have a whole bevy of information on freight forwarders. We'll get into that in upcoming sections. As a result of all these factors, and over the last 4 decades, if not even a little bit longer, the U.S. import ecosystem has evolved into a vibrant collection of players. The buyers and sellers and ocean carriers and freight forwarders and dredge companies, all the entities we've spoken of that make up this ecosystem. With that said, second bullet point, most companies in this ecosystem work together at arm's length. That just means they're not related parties. They're not the same company. Sometimes they are. A U.S. importer could be buying raw materials, for example, from a company-owned factory in Nigeria. That certainly happens where companies are related. Most of the time, they're not. Third bullet, and we've said this previously, there are a minimum of at least 10 players in a basic ocean import transaction. Buyer-seller, origin-destination trucker, origin-destination customs entity, freight forwarder, customs broker, ocean carrier, airline. There's at least 10, if not more. As a note, naturally, the upcoming slides are dedicated to describing the entities that make up the U.S. maritime import ecosystem. You should know by now that we here at Mercado like to be thorough. We're going to go through ocean transportation and its many players in excruciating detail, starting now. A quick transition slide, aptly titled, The Ocean Transportation Ecosystem. Who are the key players? We're presenting this information in a quasi-alphabetical fashion, trying to create a balance between keeping order, but also making sense of the sequential role of all these players, meaning who does what first. These slides are not entirely in alphabetical order, but as best we could without confusing the issue. We'll start off with the letter C, a chassis leasing company. And in these upcoming slides, we should point out that the images on the right-hand side hopefully help to portray what we're talking about. A chassis leasing company, and you're looking at chassis. These are the wheeled metal frames upon which ocean containers are placed and transported. Inland transportation, drayage, couldn't happen without a chassis. So a chassis leasing company is a business that leases container chassis to trucking companies, steamship lines, or chassis pools. They play a vital role, certainly here in the United States and other places around the world. Chassis pools, an interesting concept that has come into play over the last 10 years or so, which are made up of two or more organizations, companies basically, that agree to purchase and or lease ocean container chassis for their multiple use. Los Angeles and Long Beach ports are a good example of this, where multiple entities will get together, say 3 companies, will each donate, not exactly donate, they will purchase and then make use of 1,000 chassis each. But each member of the chassis pool gets to use the chassis of the other organizations. They're intermixed, basically. Chassis pools play a big role in the U.S. Crating companies, these are firms that specialize in third-party wood crating for fragile, oversized, and overweight cargo. That can be for exports from the United States, but also companies overseas that crate up large pieces of machinery, perhaps, that are going to be imported into the U.S. What else do we have here? Dredge companies, you can see on the right. These are truckers going into a port complex, into a terminal, some to pick up, some to drop off containers. As you can see from the photo, it should be clear that these trucks, these drayage companies, aren't carrying containers, so they're not dropping anything off. It's highly likely they're going to pick up containers off of the terminal. That's what drayage is, short-haul truck transportation to or from a port or a rail facility. A full truckload carrier, of course, they play a big role here in the United States, especially once goods are cleared through customs and have to be trucked to other places. FTL, as it's called, full truckload carrier. These are firms that pick up and deliver containers or trailers for long-haul journeys. Ocean freight forwarder. Different iterations of the ocean freight forwarder will come up multiple times, both in the ocean module and the air freight module. We'll see it from different perspectives. But a solid definition to start things out is a person that dispatches shipments from the U.S. via a common carrier and books or otherwise arranges space for those shipments on behalf of shippers. It's kind of a technical definition, actually. We present the ocean freight forwarder as an analogy to a travel agent for cargo. You'll see that in an upcoming slide. This is a more technical, even legal definition, although we're not lawyers here at Mercado. It's portrayed, the ocean forwarder is portrayed as a person. That's a legal term. And a person is not just a human being in legal terms. It can be a company. It can be a corporation. It can be a government entity. That's what we mean by person here. Typically, an ocean freight forwarder, it's a company that helps importers and exporters to organize the physical movement of goods. While not necessary or mandatory, ocean freight forwarders for imports into the U.S. play a huge role. More on that later. Last slide in this section, the FMC, the Federal Maritime Commission. We have a bunch of slides, a whole section on the FMC. But let's say that the Federal Maritime Commission is an independent federal U.S. agency that regulates the U.S. international ocean transportation system. That's both domestic and international. The FMC, critical to ocean transportation in the U.S. We'll see what they do in just a bit. And then, starting to introduce some semi-new terminology, a full container load NVOCC, non-vessel operating common carrier. We have detailed definitions on an NVOCC. If you're not familiar with it, don't worry. But a non-vessel operating common carrier is just that. A carrier that is licensed by the FMC to act as a steamship line without the burden of having to own any ships. That might sound a little weird right now. We'll come back to it. Don't worry about it just yet. But a full container load NVOCC, which we will talk about in vast detail, are companies that specialize in the provision of services related to full container load shipments. You can see a bunch of containers on the right-hand side here. We'll be talking about FCL, as it's referred to, in a bunch of sections. That's it for Section 3. When we come back, we'll continue on in our quasi-alphabetical presentation of key players in the ocean transportation ecosystem by talking about less than container load NVOCCs.